January 1942. The North Atlantic Ocean. Captain Lieutenant Reinhard Hardigan stood in the conning tower of U-123 and looked at the lights of the American coastline with the particular satisfaction of a hunter who has found his prey in a place it did not expect to be found. It was January 1942, 6 weeks after Pearl Harbor, and the eastern seaboard of the United States was still lit up at night as if there were no war. Hotels blazed with neon signs. Beach towns left their streetlights burning. Ships traveling the coastal shipping lanes showed navigation lights that made them visible for miles against the bright backdrop of the American shore. Hardigan had been given a mission that German submarine command called Operation Drumbeat, Paukenschlag, and it was one of the most effective offensive operations of the entire war. 6 Type 9 U-boats had been sent to the American coast in the first weeks of 1942 with instructions to attack American shipping in waters where the United States Navy had no organized convoy system, no coordinated air patrol, and no institutional experience with the anti-submarine warfare that the Battle of the Atlantic had been forcing the Royal Navy to develop since 1939. Hardigan sank 8 ships off the American coast in 2 weeks. He could have sunk more, but he ran out of torpedoes. What was happening off the American coast in January and February 1942 was what German submariners called the happy time, the Glückliche Zeit, a period of such easy killing that the submarines returned to their French bases with more confirmed tonnage than they had sunk in entire previous war patrols. American merchant seamen who had sailed coastal routes their whole lives were suddenly finding themselves in the water at night, their ships torpedoed from submarines they had never seen, dying in the dark Atlantic in the first months of a war they had not expected to fight in those waters. The Battle of the Atlantic had been going on since the first day of the war in September 1939, when a German submarine sank the British ocean liner Athenia with 1,400 passengers aboard, killing 117 of them. For 2.5 years before Pearl Harbor, the Royal Navy and the Canadian Navy and the merchant mariners who supplied Britain had been fighting a war against German submarines in the North Atlantic that determined whether Britain could continue fighting at all. Winston Churchill said after the war that the only thing that really frightened him during the war was the U-boat peril. He was not prone to excessive statements about fear. He meant it. Britain was an island nation whose industrial economy depended on imported raw materials and whose population required imported food. The merchant shipping that carried those materials and that food crossed the Atlantic in convoys that the German submarine arm, the Kriegsmarine's U-boat force, was attempting to destroy at a rate sufficient to starve the island into surrender or submission. The mathematics of the Battle of the Atlantic were simple and brutal. Every ship sunk by a U-boat was a ship whose cargo was lost, a ship that took weeks or months to replace if it could be replaced at all, a ship that cost the lives of its crew and the sailors who tried to rescue them. Every ship that reached Britain was food and fuel and ammunition and equipment that kept the country fighting. The U-boats were built and deployed in numbers that the Allied anti-submarine capability of 1940 and 1941 could not adequately counter. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commanding the U-boat arm, had developed the tactics and the organizational system that made the submarines effective beyond anything the Allies had encountered in the First World War. The Wolfpack tactics that grouped multiple submarines to attack a convoy simultaneously overwhelmed the convoy escort's ability to protect the merchant ships. The submarines that found a convoy would shadow it on the surface, transmitting its position and course to other submarines while staying beyond the range of the convoy's radar, until enough submarines had assembled to attack from multiple directions simultaneously. The convoy escorts in 1940 and early 1941 were inadequate in numbers and in equipment. There were not enough of them to screen a convoy effectively against submarines attacking from multiple directions. Their ASDIC sonar, while effective at short range against submerged submarines, could not detect submarines operating on the surface at night, which was where the Wolfpacks operated during their attacks. The air cover that could have found and attacked the submarines during their surface approach was not available over most of the North Atlantic because no aircraft had the range to reach the mid-ocean gap where the submarines operated beyond the reach of land-based patrol aircraft. The mid-ocean gap, the area of ocean that no land-based aircraft could reach from either side of the Atlantic, became the killing ground where the Battle of the Atlantic was decided. It was called the Black Pit by the merchant mariners who had to cross it, because in the Black Pit the convoys were alone with whatever escorts were assigned to them and whatever submarines had been directed there by the information network that Dönitz headquarters maintained. American entry into the war brought resources that the Allied anti-submarine effort desperately needed, but American entry also brought the happy time off the American coast because the United States Navy had not learned the lessons that the Royal Navy had been learning in blood and steel since 1939. The months before the convoy system was established on the American coast, before the blackout regulations were enforced, before the anti-submarine aircraft patrols were organized, were the worst months of the entire Battle of the Atlantic for Allied shipping. In the first 6 months of 1942, German submarines sank more tonnage than in any equivalent period of the war. The production rates of American shipyards, which were already being ramped up under the emergency wartime programs that Henry Kaiser and the other shipbuilders had been developing since 1940, were barely keeping pace with the losses. The turning of the Battle of the Atlantic required technology, and it required organization, and it required the particular quality of applied intelligence that the combination of American industrial capacity and British cryptographic expertise produced when they were combined effectively. The technology came from multiple directions simultaneously. The centimetric radar that began to be deployed on Allied anti-submarine vessels and aircraft in 1942 and 1943 could detect surface submarines at ranges and in conditions that the earlier metric wavelength radar could not. The Lee light, a powerful searchlight fitted to patrol aircraft, allowed aircrews to illuminate and attack submarines that they had detected on radar but could not see in the darkness. The forward-throwing anti-submarine weapons, Hedgehog and Squid, allowed convoy escorts to attack submarines while maintaining ASDIC contact, which the older depth charge attacks prevented because the explosion pattern disrupted the sonar contact. The organization came from the convoy system itself and from the operational intelligence centers that both the British and American navies established to track U-boat positions and route convoys away from known submarine concentrations. The intelligence that these centers used came from multiple sources, including communications intelligence from the code-breaking efforts at Bletchley Park in Britain, from the decryption of German naval communications that revealed U-boat positions and patrol areas, and from the accumulated tactical experience of hundreds of convoy battles. The intelligence dimension of the Battle of the Atlantic was itself one of the most consequential intelligence competitions in history. The Germans used the Enigma encryption machine to encode their naval communications, believing the cipher to be unbreakable. The British had been working since 1940 to break Enigma, and the capture of codebooks and cipher machines from German vessels and submarines at sea, combined with the mathematical breakthroughs at Bletchley Park, had given the Allies partial access to German naval communications that was sometimes sufficient to route convoys away from submarine concentrations. But the Germans also had their own cryptographic intelligence capability. The B-Dienst, German Naval Signals Intelligence, had broken the British Naval Cipher No. 3, which was used to communicate convoy routing information, and was reading Allied convoy signals with sufficient accuracy to direct U-boats toward convoys whose positions had been transmitted in the compromised cipher. The Battle of the Atlantic was simultaneously a battle between ships and submarines and a battle between codebreakers and cipher experts, with each side trying to read the other's communications while protecting its own. The escort carriers that entered service in 1943 were the technology that most directly addressed the problem of the mid-ocean gap. Small aircraft carriers that could accompany convoys across the Atlantic and provide air cover for the entire voyage rather than just the portions within range of land-based aircraft changed the tactical equation fundamentally. A submarine that surfaced to charge its batteries or to make a radio report in the mid-ocean gap now faced the possibility of being found and attacked by aircraft from the escort carrier's anti-submarine patrol. Commander Kenneth Knowles, who directed the U-boat tracking room at the United States Navy's Operational Intelligence Center in Washington from 1943 onward, was one of the intelligence officers whose work most directly contributed to winning the Battle of the Atlantic. The tracking room that Knowles directed maintained a plot of U-boat positions based on the accumulation of intelligence from code-breaking, radio direction finding, and the analysis of U-boat sighting reports. This plot was used to route convoys around known submarine concentrations and to direct hunter-killer groups towards submarines whose positions were known. The hunter-killer groups were the offensive element that took the Battle of the Atlantic from a defensive struggle to an active campaign to destroy the U-boat force. Groups built around escort carriers with their anti-submarine aircraft, operating in the areas where U-boat concentrations had been identified, could search out and destroy submarines that were not specifically threatening a convoy. Captain Frederick Walker, a British Royal Navy officer who became the leading anti-submarine warfare practitioner of the entire war, developed the tactics and the philosophy that defined the hunter-killer approach. Walker understood that the objective was not merely to defend convoys but to kill submarines, and that killing submarines required a different approach from convoy escort, an aggressive forward deployment that took the battle to the submarines rather than waiting for the submarines to come to the convoys. Walker's support group sank more U-boats than any other Allied anti-submarine formation of the war. He drove his ships and his crews at a pace that his superiors worried was unsustainable, and that proved to be exactly that. Walker died of a stroke in Liverpool in July 1944 at the age of 48, killed by the pace he had maintained through 4 years of anti-submarine warfare. The turning point of the Battle of the Atlantic came in May 1943, the month that German submariners called Black May. In a single month, Allied forces sank 41 U-boats, a rate of attrition that Dönitz could not sustain. On May 24th, Dönitz withdrew his submarines from the North Atlantic convoy routes, acknowledging for the first time that the Allied anti-submarine capability had become too effective for the tactical situation to continue. The withdrawal was not permanent, and it was not a final victory. The U-boats returned to the Atlantic with new equipment and new tactics, including the snorkel breathing device that allowed submarines to operate their diesel engines while submerged, reducing their vulnerability to radar-equipped aircraft. But they never regained the effectiveness they had achieved in 1942 and early 1943. The combination of technology, intelligence, and aggressive anti-submarine tactics that the Allies had developed had permanently altered the balance of the Atlantic battle. The cost of winning the Battle of the Atlantic was staggering. Approximately 3,500 Allied merchant ships were sunk during the war, killing approximately 72,000 merchant mariners. The merchant marine suffered the highest casualty rate per capita of any branch of the Allied war effort, higher than the infantry, higher than the submarine service, higher than any other fighting arm. The men who sailed the merchant ships were not military personnel. They were civilians, seamen who sailed in unarmored ships carrying food and fuel and ammunition through waters where submarines were trying to kill them. They kept sailing. The United States Merchant Marine expanded dramatically from its peacetime size to meet the wartime demand, produced merchant mariners from the same broad cross-section of American society that the military drew from. Young men who had never been to sea before 1941 were sailing the North Atlantic convoy routes by 1942, learning seamanship and survival in conditions that the established merchant mariners who trained them described with the honest bluntness of people who understood the odds. Approximately 9,300 American merchant mariners were killed in the war. They did not receive veterans' benefits until 1988, when Congress finally recognized their service with the same legal status it granted to military personnel. They had spent 43 years after the war's end without official recognition of what they had done. The Liberty ships that carried most of the cargo across the Atlantic were themselves a story of American industrial achievement that paralleled the more celebrated achievements of the war. Henry Kaiser, a California contractor with no shipbuilding experience, had promised the Roosevelt administration that his shipyards could produce Liberty ships faster than the German submarines could sink them. He delivered on that promise with a production rate that exceeded every previous standard in the history of shipbuilding. The Robert E. Peary was built in 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes. The standard construction time for a Liberty ship at Kaiser's yards declined from 355 days in 1941 to an average of 42 days by 1943. The American shipbuilding industry, starting essentially from scratch in 1941, produced 2,710 Liberty ships during the war, more than compensating for the losses that German submarines were inflicting. The mathematics that Dönitz had calculated in 1941 and 1942, the equation that required sinking ships faster than they could be built, stopped being valid when American shipyards achieved the production rates that Kaiser had promised. The industrial capacity that could build a ship in 4 days and 15 hours was producing ships faster than the submarines could sink them regardless of how many submarines were operating. That was the Battle of the Atlantic. Not a single dramatic engagement, but a 3-year industrial and technological and human competition, fought on the most hostile and unforgiving battlefield that war provides, the deep North Atlantic in winter, by men on both sides who understood that what they were fighting for was the fundamental question of whether the Allied coalition could sustain itself. The Allied coalition sustained itself. The convoys kept sailing. The supplies kept flowing. Britain did not starve. The invasion of North Africa and then Sicily and then Normandy was supplied across an Atlantic that had been contested and had been won. Admiral Dönitz, reviewing the Battle of the Atlantic after the war, said that the Allied victory had been won not by superior seamanship or superior courage, because he believed his submarine crews matched the Allied sailors in both. It had been won by superior technology and superior production, and the particular American genius for applying industrial capacity to military problems faster than any opponent could adapt. He was right about that. The Battle of the Atlantic was won in the shipyards of Kaiser and the other American builders who produced ships faster than submarines could sink them. It was won in the laboratories where centimetric radar and Lee lights and hedgehog projectors were developed. It was won in the code-breaking rooms where German naval communications were decrypted. It was won by the escort carrier pilots who flew through North Atlantic weather that grounded shore-based aviation. And it was won by the merchant mariners who sailed through submarine-infested waters because the supplies had to get through and they were the people taking them. They kept sailing. The supplies kept flowing. The war was won. That is the Battle of the Atlantic. That is what the longest campaign of the Second World War was, and what it cost, and why it mattered. Without winning the Battle of the Atlantic, nothing else could have been won. The men who won it deserve to be remembered with the same clarity as the men who charged the beaches at Normandy or flew the missions over Germany. They sailed into the black pit in the middle of the North Atlantic, in the worst weather in the world, without air cover, with submarines hunting them, and they kept going. That was enough. That saved everything.